The greenhouse was dying. Thomas Meridian stood in the center of it. His cathedral of glass and green, his life's work, his monument to control, and watched everything wilt. The orchids first, their delicate petals browning at the edges, curling inward like hands closing around secrets. Then the ferns, their fronds yellowing despite the perfect humidity he'd calibrated. The tomatoes rotting on the vine, the herbs turning brittle and gray. He had spent his entire life creating perfect conditions for growth. And yet everything was dying anyway, including him. It had been 3 months since Clara's funeral. 92 days if he was counting, which he couldn't stop doing, the way his mind couldn't stop cataloging all his failures. Every plant he couldn't save, every invoice he couldn't pay, every morning he woke up and forgot for 3 beautiful seconds that she was gone before remembering crashed through him like glass breaking. The greenhouse felt haunted. Not by Clara. She had never loved this place, had always preferred the wild tangle of the yard outside, but by the ghost of who Thomas used to be. The man who believed knowledge could prevent suffering. Who thought that if he just controlled enough variables, measured enough data, perfected enough systems, nothing bad could happen. That man was as dead as the plants surrounding him. Thomas walked through the rows, his footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. The misting system was broken. Had been for weeks. He should fix it. Should do a lot of things. Pay the mounting bills stacked on his desk. Return the calls from creditors. Tend to the dozens of orders he'd stopped filling. But every time he tried to muster the energy, the will, the basic human capacity to function, he found only emptiness where those things used to live. He stopped in front of the propagation table, the one where he'd worked during Clara's final weeks. While she lay in the hospital bed they'd set up in the house, he'd been out here researching medicinal plants. Feverfew for pain, milk thistle for liver function, turmeric for inflammation. He'd filled notebooks with dosages and contraindications. Had believed, with the desperate faith of a drowning man, that somewhere in the botanical world was the combination that would save her. He'd been so certain, so focused, so completely catastrophically wrong. The memory surfaced without permission the way they all did now. Clara in that hospital bed, her body small under the white sheets, her eyes following him as he moved around the room with his mortar and pestle, grinding herbs, checking his notes, preparing remedies with the precision of ritual. "Thomas," she'd said, her voice thin and tired. "Come here. Just a minute. I need to get the proportions right. Please. Just come here." Something in her tone had made him look up. Really look. She'd had her hand extended toward him. Palm up. Empty. An offering and a request all at once. "I need to finish this," he'd said, gesturing to his work. The timing matters for efficacy. Her hand had dropped back to the bed. So slowly, like something breaking in slow motion. "Okay," she'd whispered. She didn't ask again. Thomas pressed his palms against the propagation table now, 3 months too late to understand, and felt the weight of that moment crushing his chest. She hadn't wanted medicine. She'd wanted him, his hand in hers, his body next to hers, his presence, undistracted by his desperate need to fix what couldn't be fixed. But he couldn't understand the difference. To stop trying felt like giving up. To sit with her in her fear felt like admitting defeat. So he'd kept grinding herbs, kept researching, kept building elaborate scaffolding around his denial while she quietly, gracefully, slipped away. The botanist who couldn't save anything that mattered. His phone buzzed. He ignored it. It would be another creditor. Another bill he couldn't pay. The greenhouse business was failing. Had been failing since Clara got sick, hemorrhaging money while Thomas hemorrhaged attention. His clients had gone elsewhere. His reputation had eroded. And he couldn't bring himself to care about any of it. What was the point? He'd built this entire operation on a single premise. That growth could be controlled. That if you understood the science, the pH levels, the nutrient ratios, the lumens and wavelengths and temperatures, you could make anything thrive. You could prevent loss. You could engineer life itself. But Clara had died anyway, despite his knowledge, despite his desperate attempts, despite everything he thought he knew about nurturing living things. The premise was false, which meant everything he'd built on that premise was false, which meant he was false. Thomas walked to the far end of the greenhouse, where Clara's things still sat untouched. The painted pots she'd made, butterflies and hummingbirds in bright, optimistic colors that now felt like accusations. The gardening gloves she'd worn, still holding the shape of her hands. The straw hat with the faded ribbon. He picked up one of the pots, turned it in his hands. She'd painted this one on a good day, between rounds of chemo, when she still had enough energy to create. A monarch butterfly, wings spread wide, flying toward something beyond the frame. "You always loved the wild things," he said to the empty air, to her absence, to the ghost that wasn't there. "The things I couldn't control." She used to tell him that, gently, teasingly, but with something underneath it, some truth she was trying to help him see. "You're so busy managing growth," she'd said once, watching him adjust grow lights, "that you miss the magic of it, the way it just happens, without permission, without perfect conditions." "That's called invasive species," he'd replied, not looking up from his light meter. "Chaos isn't magic. It's just unmanaged variables." She'd laughed, but sadly, the way you laugh when someone you love is missing something essential and you don't know how to show them. He understood now. Too late, but he understood. Thomas set the pot down carefully. His phone buzzed again. This time he looked. An email notification. From the bank. Subject line: foreclosure notice. He read it twice. The greenhouse would be seized in 2 weeks. All assets liquidated. Everything he'd built would be dismantled and sold to pay debts he'd let accumulate while pretending he could urban light spectrum his way out of grief. He should feel something. Panic, maybe. Fear. The desperate, scrambling instinct to save himself. Instead, he felt only a strange, distant relief. Let it go. Let it all go. What was he holding on to anyway? A building full of dying plants. A business model based on the arrogant assumption that he could outscience nature. A life that had stopped making sense the moment Clara's heart stopped beating. Thomas walked to the center of the greenhouse one last time. Stood in the fading afternoon light filtering through the glass panels. All around him, his carefully curated plants withered in their perfect rows. The systems he'd built hummed uselessly. The climate controls maintained conditions for growth that was no longer happening. He had believed light was necessary for all beautiful things to bloom. He had believed control was love. He had believed knowledge could prevent loss. He had been wrong about everything. And now, standing in his cathedral of dying things, Thomas Meridian finally understood what Clara had been trying to tell him all along. Some lessons can't be learned in the light. Some truths only reveal themselves when everything you've built collapses into darkness. Some kinds of growth require the death of everything you thought you knew. He turned off the lights. All of them. Plunged his greenhouse into shadow. And for the first time in 3 months, for the first time in 47 years, maybe, he stopped trying to fix what was broken. He just stood in the dark and waited to see what would happen next. Thomas was 8 years old when he first learned that some things refused to be saved. His mother's garden had been the pride of their small yard. Roses climbing the fence, tomatoes heavy on their vines, herbs that made the whole summer smell like possibility. She would hum while she worked, her hands dark with soil, her face turned toward the sun. Thomas would sit on the porch steps and watch her move between the rows, believing, as children do, that nothing beautiful could ever end. Then his father left. Just left. One Tuesday morning in July, his mother stopped going outside. The garden became Thomas's responsibility, though no one actually said so. He simply understood that someone had to try. He watered when he remembered. He pulled at weeds that seemed to multiply overnight. He stood in the dirt, 8 years old and terrified, whispering to the wilting plants like prayers might make them grow. They died anyway. All of them. The roses browned and fell. The tomatoes rotted on the vine. The herbs turned brittle and gray. Thomas watched his mother watch from the kitchen window, her face as empty as the garden beds, and something hardened in him. A small, desperate vow. I will never be powerless like this again. I will learn how things grow. I will master it. I will control it. He carried that vow like a stone in his pocket for the next 39 years. By the time he met Clara Whitmore at the International Botanical Conference in Portland, Thomas had become exactly what he'd promised himself he would be. A man of precision, of knowledge, of control. He had 3 advanced degrees, 2 published books, and a greenhouse operation that ran like clockwork. He understood photosynthesis the way other men understood sports statistics. He could tell you the exact pH level, the precise amount of lumens, the ideal humidity for any plant to thrive. He could make anything grow, as long as he controlled the conditions. Clara was different. She stood in the conference hall surrounded by people who spoke in Latin names and chemical compounds, and she was laughing at a photograph of weeds breaking through concrete. "Look at this," she said to no one in particular, her voice bright with wonder. "No one planted them. No one tends them. And yet they're the most alive things in the city." Thomas had been standing close enough to hear, close enough to see the way her eyes lit up, the way her hands moved when she talked, like she was trying to hold something wild and beautiful that might fly away. "That's not growth," he'd said, unable to help himself. "That's chaos." She turned to him then, really looked at him, and smiled in a way that made him feel like he'd just said something deeply amusing. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe chaos is just a word we use for patterns we don't control." He should have understood then what she was trying to tell him. They married 18 months later. Thomas built her a conservatory as a wedding gift, climate-controlled, perfectly lit, a cathedral of glass and green. She thanked him, kissed him, and then spent most of her time in the overgrown lot behind their house, photographing wildflowers and collecting seeds from plants that had no names in his textbooks. "Why do you love the wild things so much?" he'd asked her once, genuinely confused. "Because they don't need me to love them," she'd said. "They grow anyway." He hadn't understood. Not then. 2 years ago, Clara had come home from a routine checkup with a word that changed everything. Lymphoma. Aggressive. Stage 3. The oncologist gave them statistics, treatment options, timelines that felt both too long and too short. Thomas's response was immediate. Absolute. He would fix this. He transformed half the greenhouse into a medicinal garden. Turmeric for inflammation, milk thistle for the liver, ginger for nausea, dozens of herbs promising healing in their leaves. He researched clinical trials. He consulted specialists across 3 continents. He created spreadsheets of treatment protocols, dietary plans, supplement schedules. He built her a special chair in the greenhouse, surrounded by plants, flooded with full-spectrum light. "Thomas," Clara had said one afternoon, her voice thin from chemotherapy, "can we just sit together? Just be?" "After I finish this," he'd replied, adjusting the grow lights, "I'm calibrating the spectrum. Studies show that certain wavelengths can boost immune function." She'd closed her eyes. He'd thought she was resting. She was giving up on reaching him. The memory sat in Thomas's chest now, in his dark basement, heavy as wet earth. He could see it so clearly. Clara in that chair, exhausted and alone despite his presence, while he measured and mixed and desperately tried to science his way out of loss. She hadn't needed his solutions. She'd needed his hand in hers, his body beside hers, his willingness to sit in the terrible truth that some things cannot be fixed, only witnessed. But he couldn't do it. Stopping felt like surrender. Accepting felt like betrayal. So he'd worked harder, researched deeper, controlled everything he could control. Everything except the thing that mattered. Can love exist without the need to fix, to save, to control? He didn't know. He'd never tried. The question hung in the darkness of his basement like something alive. And for the first time since he was 8 years old, standing in his mother's dying garden, Thomas Meridian had no answer, no plan, no way to make things grow through sheer force of knowledge. He had only the terrible, liberating truth that he'd been wrong about everything. And that maybe, just maybe, that was exactly where transformation begins. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Thursday. Thomas held the paper in his hands. Crisp, official, final, and felt nothing. Or perhaps he felt everything at once, which amounts to the same thing. A numbness so complete it becomes its own sensation. The greenhouse would be seized in 14 days. Everything inside it. Everything he'd built. He should have seen it coming. The unpaid invoices stacking up on his desk. The clients who'd stopped calling after Clara died. The way he'd let the business dissolve while he dissolved with it. But knowing something is coming and feeling it arrive are 2 different experiences entirely. 14 days to dismantle a life. He spent the first 3 days trying to save what he could. He called creditors, begged for extensions, sketched impossible plans for recovery. But the numbers didn't lie, and the numbers said he was finished. The greenhouse, the equipment, even the plants themselves, it would all be liquidated to pay debts he could no longer outrun. On the 4th day, the workers came. Thomas stood in the parking lot and watched them arrive. A crew of 6 men with dollies and work gloves and the efficient indifference of people paid to erase other people's dreams. They moved through his greenhouse like surgeons performing an autopsy, methodically removing organs from a body that had already stopped breathing. The misting system came down first. Then the grow lights unbolted from their ceiling mounts, leaving dark rectangles where there had been artificial suns. The climate control panels, the irrigation lines, the glass shelves that had held hundreds of seedlings in their careful rows. One worker carried out the brass thermometer that had belonged to Thomas's mentor. Another wheeled out the propagation table where Thomas had grafted his first successful hybrid. They were just objects to them. Metal and wood and glass. They couldn't know that each piece held a memory, a choice, a version of Thomas that no longer existed. He watched a young man, couldn't have been more than 20, carry out the terracotta pots Clara had painted by hand. Butterflies and hummingbirds in bright, optimistic colors. The kids stacked them carelessly in a cardboard box, 3 chipping against each other. Thomas opened his mouth to protest, to say be careful, those were hers, she made those. But what came out was nothing, just breath, just air leaving lungs. What was the point? By late afternoon, the greenhouse stood empty. Just the skeleton of it remained, the glass walls, the metal frame, the concrete floor stained with years of water and soil and growth. It looked like a ribcage, like something that had once held a beating heart and now held only absence. Thomas walked inside one last time. His footsteps echoed in the hollow space. No more humid warmth. No more green smell of living things. Just emptiness and the sound of his own breathing. He had believed this place was permanent. Had believed his knowledge, his control, his careful systems would protect him from the chaos Clara loved so much. But chaos doesn't care what you believe. Comes anyway. And when it does, all your greenhouses and grow lights and precise measurements can't save you. Nothing can. The apartment he could afford was in the basement of a converted Victorian on the east side of town. The landlord, a tired woman named Mrs. Chun, led him down narrow stairs into what she generously called a garden-level studio. Garden level. The term was almost cruel. There were no gardens here. No windows either. Just a small rectangular room with concrete walls painted an optimistic beige, a kitchenette that smelled faintly of mildew, and a bathroom with a toilet that ran constantly. One bare bulb hung from the ceiling. Fluorescent. The kind of light that makes everything look already dead. It's quiet, Mrs. Chin offered. Private. Thomas nodded. He signed the lease with a pen that barely worked, his signature coming out faint and ghostly. He moved in that same day with 2 suitcases and 3 cardboard boxes, everything he owned now that the greenhouse was gone. The darkness was absolute. Even during the day, no natural light reached the basement. He tried the overhead bulb once, but its harsh buzzing made him feel like an insect under examination. So he turned it off and sat in the dark instead. Felt more honest somehow, like his external world had finally caught up to his internal one. He unpacked slowly, mechanically, clothes in the closet, books on the floor, random objects he'd grabbed without thinking. A coffee mug, a framed photo of Clara he immediately turned face down, a stack of botanical journals he'd never read again. At the bottom of the last box, wrapped in an old sweater, he found Clara's copy of Pilgrim at Tinker Creek by Annie Dillard. She'd loved that book. Read it every year. The cover was soft from handling, the pages swollen from being read in the bathtub. Thomas held it in the darkness, running his thumb along the spine. He couldn't remember packing it, couldn't remember deciding to keep it. But here it was, this thing she'd touched, this thing that had mattered to her. He opened it randomly, not really reading, just feeling the texture of the paper, and something fell out. A piece of paper, folded in half, in Clara's handwriting. His heart stopped, then started again too fast. He turned on the overhead light. The buzzing felt appropriate now, necessary. He unfolded the letter with shaking hands. Thomas, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I've been trying to figure out when to give this to you, before feels cruel, after feels cowardly. So I'm hiding it here, in this book you've never read, hoping you'll find it when you need it most. You spent so much time trying to bring me into the light, building that greenhouse, those gardens, all those remedies. I know you did it because you love me, because you couldn't bear to lose me, because watching someone die without fixing it goes against everything you are. But Thomas, here's what I need you to understand. You were so busy trying to save me that you never sat with me in the dark. And there were moments, so many moments, when all I wanted was for you to stop trying, to stop researching, to stop building, to just be with me, in the fear, in the sadness, in the terrible, beautiful truth that I was dying and there was nothing either of us could do about it. Some things only grow in darkness. Some kinds of intimacy, some depths of love. I wish you could see that. I wish you could stop running from the dark long enough to discover what lives there. I'm not angry. I'm just sad that we missed each other at the end. You were reaching for the light while I was learning to see in the dark. Maybe someday you'll understand. Maybe someday you'll stop trying to control everything and just let yourself feel. Let yourself break. Let yourself be held by something you can't measure or manage. The darkness isn't the enemy, my love. It's just a different kind of soil. I hope you plant yourself there someday. I think you'd be amazed at what grows. All my love, Clara. Thomas read it once, twice, 3 times. The words blurred. His hands trembled. The fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead like a dying insect. She'd known. She'd known all along what he was doing, how he was failing, and she tried to tell him, in her way, and he'd been too busy calibrating light spectrums to listen. He sank to the floor, his back against the cold concrete wall, the letter clutched in his hands. And for the first time since she died, for the first time in years, maybe, Thomas Meridian stopped trying to fix anything, stopped planning, stopped searching for solutions. He just sat in the dark and wept. The grief came like a dam breaking, not clean or pretty or manageable, just raw, ugly, animal sounds that came from somewhere deeper than his throat. He cried for Clara, for the greenhouse, for the version of himself that had believed love meant solving problems instead of sharing them, for all the moments he'd missed while desperately trying to manufacture moments that could never be manufactured. He cried until he was empty, until there was nothing left but the silence and the darkness and the question Clara had left him with. What if darkness isn't the absence of growth, but a different kind of soil? He didn't have an answer. Sitting there on the concrete floor of his basement apartment, surrounded by the ruins of everything he built, Thomas didn't have answers to anything anymore. But maybe, just maybe, that was the point. Maybe the first seed of wisdom is planted in the soil of not knowing, in the dark, fertile ground of absolute loss, in the place where all your light has finally gone out, and you have no choice but to learn a different way of seeing. Thomas turned off the overhead bulb. The darkness rushed back in, complete and heavy and strangely gentle. And for the first time in his life, he didn't fight it. He let it hold him. Thomas stopped. Not in the way people stop when they're tired and need rest. Not in the way people stop when they're gathering strength for the next push forward. He stopped the way a clock stops when its mechanism finally breaks. Completely, irrevocably, without any promise of starting again. He stopped looking for work, stopped checking his email, stopped answering his phone when it rang, which became less and less frequent until it didn't ring at all. The world outside his basement continued its frantic spinning. People rushed to jobs, made plans, solved problems, lived their illuminated lives. But Thomas remained still in his underground dark, like a stone at the bottom of a river, letting everything flow past him. Mrs. Chun knocked once to check if he was alive. He answered the door, pale and unshaven, and she'd looked at him with something between concern and recognition, like she'd seen this before, like she knew what it looked like when someone stops pretending. "You okay?" she asked. He almost laughed. Such a simple question. Such an impossible answer. "No," he said, and the honesty felt like the first true thing he'd said in months. She nodded, didn't push, just said, "Rent's due on the 1st," and left him to his darkness. Days blurred together. Or maybe they didn't blur. Maybe he was finally seeing them clearly for the first time, unmarked by the desperate activity he'd used to avoid feeling them. He slept when he was tired, ate when hunger became impossible to ignore, sat in the dark for hours doing nothing, thinking nothing, being nothing. It should have felt like depression, and maybe it was, but it also felt like something else, like excavation, like archaeology, like carefully brushing away layers of dirt to see what had been buried underneath. The memories came in the stillness, not the memories he'd chosen to keep, the happy ones, the safe ones, the ones that confirmed his version of their story. These were different, sharper, the ones he'd been running from. Clara in the hospital bed after her second round of chemo, her skin gray, her eyes distant. Thomas had been reading aloud from a research paper about immunotherapy trials. Excited, hopeful, certain this might be the answer. "Thomas," she'd interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stop. But this study shows. Please, just stop." He'd looked up then, really looked, and seen tears on her cheeks. Silent, steady. "What's wrong?" he'd asked, already reaching for solutions. "Are you in pain? Should I call the nurse?" "I'm scared," she'd said. Just that. "I'm scared." And he'd frozen, completely frozen, because fear wasn't something he knew how to treat. It wasn't a symptom with a protocol. It was just human, raw, requiring nothing but presence. "It's going to be okay," he'd said automatically, the most useless words in the English language. "We're going to beat this." She'd closed her eyes, turned her face away, and he'd gone back to reading about clinical trials. The memory sat in Thomas's chest like a stone. He could feel it now, really feel it, the moment she'd reached for him and he'd offered her research instead of his hand. The moment she'd asked him to be with her in her fear and he'd tried to logic her out of it. Another memory surfaced. Their last anniversary. She'd been in remission then. Temporarily, though neither of them said it out loud. She'd wanted to go to the coast. To sit on the beach and watch the sunset. Simple. Easy. But Thomas had planned an elaborate dinner at an expensive restaurant downtown, called in favors to get a reservation, spent hours researching the menu's nutritional content to make sure everything would be easy on her compromised system. "This is too much," Clara had said in the car, wearing the dress that hung loose on her thinning frame. "Nothing's too much for you," he'd replied, smiling, certain he was doing love right. "I just wanted the ocean," she'd said softly. "I just wanted quiet." But he'd already paid the deposit, already made the reservation, already built the perfect evening in his mind. So they went to the restaurant. They ate the expensive food. They made conversation with the sommelier and the chef who came out to greet them. And the whole time, Clara had looked like someone attending her own funeral. They never made it to the beach. Thomas sat in his dark basement, 3 months after her death, and finally understood what he'd done. Not with cruelty or malice, but with something perhaps worse, with the absolute certainty that he knew what she needed better than she knew herself. He'd loved her the way a gardener loves a plant, by controlling every variable, managing every condition, never trusting the organism to know its own needs. He'd been so afraid of her dying that he'd forgotten to let her live. The realization didn't come with tears this time, came with something colder, clearer, a terrible understanding that settled into his bones like winter. Who are we when we stop performing our own rescue? Thomas was discovering the answer, and it wasn't comfortable. Without his projects, his plans, his desperate solutions, he was just a man sitting alone in the dark. Ordinary, powerless, completely, absolutely human. And maybe that's what he'd been running from all along. Not death, not failure, not even loss. Just the unbearable truth of being a person who couldn't fix everything, who couldn't save everyone, who was, despite all his knowledge and control and careful systems, fundamentally small in the face of the vast, indifferent machinery of existence. It was terrifying. It was also somehow a relief. Weeks passed, or maybe days. Time moved differently in the dark. Thomas existed. Nothing more, nothing less. He found a strange rhythm in the nothingness. Wake, sit, eat something, sit more, sleep. The absence of purpose became its own kind of purpose. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. The darkness didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. The silence didn't scream as loudly. He could breathe down here, in this sunless place, in a way he hadn't been able to breathe in his greenhouse with its artificial suns and controlled climates. One night, or was it 3 in the morning? Time had become suggestion rather than fact. Thomas woke from a dreamless sleep. The air felt different, thick, organic. He reached for the light switch, then stopped. His eyes had adjusted to the darkness. Not completely, but enough. Enough to see shapes, shadows, the dim outline of his sparse furniture. And in the corner, near the pipe that sometimes leaked, something pale catching the tiny bit of ambient light that seeped under the door. He stood, crossed the room slowly, carefully, like approaching something sacred or dangerous or both. There, in the damp corner of his concrete prison, something was growing. A mushroom, small, white, delicate, its cap barely the size of a quarter, emerging from a thin stem that somehow found purchase in the crack between wall and floor. Thomas knelt before it, his heart pounding. It had no light, no soil, no one tending it. No Thomas Meridian with his advanced degrees and his climate controls and his desperate need to manage every variable. And yet it grew anyway. He reached out, stopped himself from touching it. Just looked. really looked. The mushroom was perfect in its simplicity. It didn't need him, didn't need sun, didn't need anything but darkness and damp and time. Some things only grow in the dark. Clara's words, Clara's wisdom, Clara trying to tell him what he couldn't hear until he was ready. Thomas sat back on his heels, staring at this small, impossible thing. And for the first time since the greenhouse came down, since Clara died, since his whole carefully constructed life collapsed, he felt something that wasn't grief or regret or desperate scrambling. He felt wonder, pure, simple, childlike wonder at the strangeness and resilience of life, at the way it finds cracks and seeps through, at the way it doesn't ask permission or wait for perfect conditions, at the way it just persists. The mushroom didn't know it was supposed to be impossible, so it grew anyway. Thomas thought about Clara, about how she tried to grow in her own way, wild and uncontrolled, while he desperately tried to greenhouse her, about how she'd known, even at the end, that some kinds of growth require darkness, that light isn't always the answer, that sometimes we have to stop trying to engineer perfect conditions and just trust the process we cannot see. He sat there in the dark for a long time watching the mushroom, not studying it, not analyzing it, not planning how to replicate it or control it or understand it, just being with it. And in that being, in that absolute surrender to what is rather than what should be, Thomas Meridian found something he hadn't felt in 40 years. Peace. Not the peace of solved problems, not the peace of controlled outcomes, but the deeper, stranger peace of acceptance, of letting go, of trusting that growth happens in ways we cannot predict or manage, that darkness has its own wisdom, that sometimes the most profound thing we can do is stop doing and simply allow. The mushroom grew. Thomas sat in the dark. And for the first time in his life, that was enough. Thomas became a student again, not in classrooms or lecture halls, but in the damp corner of his basement, kneeling before his accidental teacher. The mushroom had grown, slowly, steadily, without fanfare, and Thomas watched it the way monks watch flames, the way astronomers watch stars, with patience, with reverence, with the understanding that some knowledge only comes to those willing to sit in the dark and wait. He started at the library, the old Carnegie building on 5th Street, with its stone lions and hushed rooms that smelled like paper and time. He found books on mycology he'd never bothered to read before. Mushrooms had always seemed like weeds to him, opportunistic organisms that appeared where they weren't wanted. Now he read about them with the intensity of conversion, and what he learned astonished him. Mushrooms weren't plants at all. They were something else entirely. The fruiting bodies of vast underground networks called mycelium, threads that stretched for miles beneath forests, connecting trees, sharing nutrients, communicating in ways science was only beginning to understand. They were nature's internet, nature's recyclers, the bridge between death and life. They broke down what had died and transformed it into food for what would live. Thomas sat in the library reading this, and something cracked open in his chest. A recognition so profound it felt like remembering rather than learning. This was what Clara had been trying to tell him. He checked out 7 books, carried them home like precious cargo, spent days reading by the dim light of his single bulb, taking notes in the margins, his mind expanding in ways his greenhouse had never allowed. In the greenhouse, he'd been master. Here, in the dark, he was apprentice. The first mushroom had been an accident. The second was intention. Thomas ordered spores online, oyster mushrooms, shiitake, lion's mane. He bought spray bottles and bags of coffee grounds from the cafe down the street. He learned about substrate and humidity and the peculiar alchemy of decomposition. Where once he would have built elaborate systems, installed expensive equipment, controlled every variable, now he worked with what he had. Cardboard boxes, plastic bins, darkness and damp and patience. The mushrooms grew. Not quickly. Not with the instant gratification of his greenhouse seedlings under their grow lights, but steadily, inevitably, like a promise being kept in a language he was only beginning to understand. He posted a sign at the cafe, fresh gourmet mushrooms, locally grown, added his phone number, expected nothing. The call came on a Tuesday. "This the mushroom guy?" A woman's voice, hurried, professional. Yes, Thomas said, the label feeling strange and somehow right. "I'm Chef Lisa Rodriguez at Ember. We're doing a spring menu focused on local ingredients. What have you got?" Thomas looked at his basement operation. 5 plastic totes growing oyster mushrooms in various stages. Another bin of lion's mane just beginning to fruit. It was nothing. It was everything. "Oyster and lion's mane," he said. "Small quantities. Very small. Can I get 5 pounds of oyster by Friday?" He did the math in his head. It was possible. Barely. "Yes," he said. "Great. I'll text you the address." She hung up. Thomas stood there holding his phone, staring at his mushrooms, and felt something he hadn't felt since before Clara died. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter than that. More durable. Purpose. Not the desperate, controlling purpose of his greenhouse days, but purpose that grew from acceptance rather than fear. From working with darkness rather than against it. The delivery to Ember led to 2 more restaurants. Then a farmer's market stall. Then a waiting list. Thomas expanded carefully. More bins, better organization, learning as he went. He made mistakes. Contaminated batches. Failed experiments. But failure felt different now. Not like the end of everything, but like part of the process. Like the mushrooms teaching him their patient wisdom. He worked in the dark. He grew things that thrived in the dark. And slowly, in increments so small he barely noticed them accumulating, he became someone who could live in the dark without drowning. 6 months after the foreclosure, Thomas drove to Riverside Cemetery for the first time since Clara's funeral. Spring was beginning. Crocuses pushing through dead grass. Trees showing the first tender green of new leaves. The world doing what it does. Transforming death into life, over and over, without asking permission or needing anyone to understand. Clara's grave was in the west section, beneath an oak tree that had probably been there 100 years. Her headstone was simple granite, the way she'd requested. Clara Whitmore Meridian. She loved wild things. Thomas knelt in the grass, his jeans dampening from the morning dew. He'd brought a small bag with him, spores carefully preserved, from his most vigorous oyster mushroom strain. "I understand now," he said quietly, to her, to himself, to the earth that held what remained of her body. "What you were trying to tell me." The words came easier than he expected. "I spent so much time trying to bring you into the light. Building those gardens, those remedies, all those desperate attempts to save you. I thought that's what love was. Fixing, saving, controlling the conditions so nothing bad could happen." He paused, feeling the weight of it. "But I was wrong." A breeze moved through the oak branches above. Gentle, listening, maybe, or maybe just wind. "You didn't need me to save you. You needed me to sit with you. To be with you in the scared places. To stop trying to solve your dying and just hold your hand while it happened." His voice cracked. "And I couldn't do it. I was too afraid. Too desperate. Too convinced that my love had to be useful to be real." He opened the bag of spores. They looked like fine dust, like nothing at all. But he knew better now. "These are mushrooms," he said, feeling strange and right, talking to stone and earth. "They grow in the dark. They break down what's dead and turn it into food for what's living. They don't need light. They need darkness. They need decay. They need things to end so other things can begin." He pressed the spores into the soil at the base of her headstone. Worked them into the earth with his fingers, the dirt collecting under his nails the way it used to in her garden, in his mother's garden, in all the gardens he tried to control and perfect and save from themselves. "I'm growing things in the dark now," he said. "And Clara, they're beautiful. They're so beautiful. All these years I thought darkness was the enemy, that growth only happened in the light. But you knew. You tried to tell me. Some things only crack open in the absolute dark." He sat back on his heels, looking at where he'd planted the spores. In a few weeks, maybe months, mycelium would spread through the soil around her grave. Eventually, mushrooms would fruit. Not because he controlled the conditions, but because death creates the perfect substrate for a certain kind of life. "I miss you," he whispered. "I miss you so much it still feels like something broken in my chest. But I'm learning to carry it differently. Not like a wound that needs healing. More like dark soil. Like the place where something new might grow. Is transformation possible without the death of who we used to be?" Thomas thought about the man he'd been. The botanist with his greenhouses and his grow lights and his absolute certainty that love meant solving problems. That man had died. Had to die. The same way Clara had to die. The same way his greenhouse had to be dismantled. The same way everything we build eventually crumbles into the earth. And from that death something else was growing. Not better necessarily. Not worse. Just different. Truer maybe. More honest about what it means to be human. To love and lose and love again anyway. To build and watch things crumble and build something new from the wreckage. To live in the brightness when we can and learn to see in the darkness when we must. "Thank you," Thomas said to the gravestone. To Clara. To whatever remained of her in the earth. In his memory. In the way she changed him. "Thank you for trying to teach me. I'm sorry I couldn't learn it while you were alive. But I'm learning now. Every day, I'm learning." He stood slowly, his knees protesting, his hands dirty with earth and spores and the residue of grief that never fully washes away. As he walked back to his car, he looked at his hands. Really looked at them. They weren't the hands of a man who controlled growth anymore. They were the hands of a man who partnered with darkness. Who understood that some of the most beautiful things happen in places we cannot see, through processes we cannot manage, in the deep underground workings of life that require nothing from us but patience and trust. The mushrooms would grow at Clara's grave. Or they wouldn't. He couldn't control it. Couldn't guarantee it. Couldn't engineer the perfect conditions. He could only plant the spores and trust that darkness knows its own work. Thomas drove home to his basement. To his bins of growing mushrooms. To his small, strange business built on organisms that thrive in places most people never look. He descended the stairs into his underground home, his cave, his dark garden, his place of transformation, and felt something he never thought he'd feel living in a sunless room. Gratitude, not for the suffering, not for the loss, but for what the suffering had taught him. For the way loss had cracked him open and allowed something truer to emerge. For the garden that grew in darkness, not despite it, but because of it. He checked his mushroom bins. Fed them fresh coffee grounds, misted them gently, spoke to them sometimes, the way Clara used to speak to her wild things, with affection and respect and zero expectation that they do anything other than what they were meant to do. And in the dark, surrounded by his strange new crops, Thomas Meridian finally understood what it meant to grow. Not up toward the light, always striving, always reaching, but down, into the soil, into the dark. Into the rich, fertile ground of acceptance where the deepest roots take hold and the strongest things learn to thrive. Clara was right. Some seeds only crack open in the absolute dark. And sometimes, if we're brave enough to stay in the darkness long enough, we discover we were the seed all along.